So it's, I heard you guys had a great New Year's Eve celebration. Praise the Lord. But today, as we jump back into our series on the life of David, I'm actually really excited to look at this because, I feel like it's so significant the way that today we're talking about David bringing the ark to Jerusalem. And I'm going to just read briefly here from 2 Samuel chapter 6. So if you guys will turn with me to 2 Samuel 6, that's the passage we're looking at today. Second Samuel 6. Now David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. Then David and all the people who were with him arose and set out from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the very name of Adonai Seubert, who is enthroned between the cherubim. So they loaded the ark of God on a new cart and carried it out of the house of Abinadab that was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, Abinadab's sons, drove the new cart as they brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, with the ark of God, and Ahio was walking in front of the ark. Oops, sorry. Okay. Meanwhile, David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating before Adonai with all the kind of instruments made of cypress wood, with harps, lyres, tambourines, three-stringed instruments, and cymbals. But when they reached the threshing floor of Nahon, Uzzah reached out to the ark of God and grasped it, for the oxen had stumbled. Then the anger of Adonai was kindled against Uzzah. God struck him down there for his irreverence, so that he died there beside the ark of God. David was upset because of Adonai's outburst against Uzzah. That place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So David was frightened of Adonai that day. Then he said, "How can the ark of Adonai come to me?" David was unwilling to move the ark of Adonai to him, to the city of David. Instead, David diverted it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. So the ark of Adonai remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. Meanwhile, Adonai blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. Then it was reported to King David, saying, "Adonai has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went and brought the ark of God up from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with joy. Now when the bearers of the ark of Adonai had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. Meanwhile, David was dancing before Adonai with all his might while he was wearing a linen ephod. So David and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of Adonai with shouting and with the sound of the shofar. But as the ark of Adonai entered the city of David, Saul's daughter Michal looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before Adonai, so she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of Adonai and set it in its place in the midst of the tent that David had pitched for it. Then David offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before Adonai. When David had finished offering the burnt offering and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of Adonai Tsevaot. Then he distributed to all the people, to the whole multitude of Israel, men and women alike, to everyone a loaf of bread, a cake made in a pan, and a raisin cake. Then all the people departed, each to his home. David returned to bless his own household. But Saul's daughter Michal came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel distinguished himself today when he uncovered himself in the eyes of his slave girls and his subjects, as any vulgar fellow would shamelessly uncover himself." "It was before Adonai," David said to Michal, "who chose me instead of your father and all his household, appointing me ruler over the people of Adonai, over Israel. So I danced before Adonai. And I will dishonor myself even more than this, and will be low in my own eyes. Yet in the eyes of the slave girls whom you mentioned, I will be honored." So Saul's daughter Michal had no children to the day of her death. Amen. So a couple of things I want to look at from this passage, but first I feel like it's important as we understand David bringing the ark into Jerusalem and the significance of it. I feel like it's worth looking at the context to see, like, where was the ark before David brought it back to Jerusalem, and why was it so significant that David returned it or brought it into the center of the nation, so to speak. And so way before David is even mentioned in 1 Samuel, we see like this, just like a really sad unfolding, just kind of a sad state of affairs. In 1 Samuel 2, we get a glimpse into a corrupt priesthood in Israel. So Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, super evil, super corrupt. What they were known for or called out for in the scriptures is the Bible actually refers to them as worthless men. Like, how would that, like, what if you just went down in the history of God as like, yeah, that's just a worthless man. Like but they were. And the reason for that is that they were priests, but they would take meat for themselves. They'd basically fork it, eat it before it was done being burned up. And the fat was done being burned up as if offering to the Lord. So it says that, they also they were sleeping with the women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. So immorality and just an irreverence in the house of God. So this was the priesthood at the time. And what the scriptures record specifically is that the sin of those men were that they treated the offering of the Lord with contempt, or they despised it. They had a very low view of like God or of the sacrifices given to God. They didn't have any fear of God, and they were just kind of using it for themselves at the end of the day. Even though they were technically in God's house, they were not doing it well. So jumping back into our timeline, so we have a corrupt priesthood. God sends a prophet to Eli, calls out Eli, is like, you didn't reign in your son, so I'm actually holding you responsible for putting them above me, and gives Eli just this very disheartening word that his household is basically always going to suffer because of this. And but that God would raise up a faithful priest who would do all that was in his heart and mind. And then you jump a little bit ahead to 1 Samuel 4, and Israel's in a battle with the Philistines, and they get defeated. So corrupt priesthood, right? Like their relationship as a nation with God is not in good standing right now. But in the midst of battle, they're like, why did God hand us over to the Philistines? Let's go get the ark so that we'll win. And so they're basically treating the Ark of the Covenant like this token, like this magical thing that if we get it, then he'll bless us. And so they try to bring it into battle with the Philistines. They're still defeated, and that's when the ark gets captured. Eli's sons are killed, and then Eli hears the news. He falls over and he dies. Then the story progresses, and after the ark is captured, it's with the Philistines. They put it in their temple in Ashdod with Dagon, their god. And what happens? Dagon falls on his face once. They put him back up. Falls on his face, breaks off his limbs, and then they're like, okay, let's put him somewhere. Let's put this ark somewhere else, right? And so they send it from city to city, but all that's happening to the Philistines is they're getting afflicted with tumors. Their gods and their idols are toppling over and breaking, and people are dying. And so finally, after a couple of moves, they're like, forget it. Like, we're going to send this back with gold mice and gold tumors to Israel. And so they put it on a cart, and they're like, you know what? If this removes the plagues from our land, then we'll know this wasn't just coincidence, but this was like an outbreak of the Lord. So they load it up, send it back to Israel. It makes it over the border to Israel where the Israelites are threshing wheat. And then they're like, oh my gosh, the ark is back. What do we do? So they offer some sacrifices, but then the thing is that they put it at this guy Abinadab's house in Kiriath Jearim, which is just this little forest town, and it sits there for decades because they were so afraid of the ark after having seen what had happened with the Philistines. They just kind of put it, and it just sits neglected for a long time. Then Samuel, as he tells the people to tear down their idols and turn back to God. And for a short season, they do. And God actually defeats their enemies. But then shortly thereafter that, Samuel's sons become corrupt. And all of Israel looks at it, and they're like, Samuel, you're old. You're not going to be here very long. We don't trust your sons. We want a king. And so it's in this context that the ark has been pushed aside. God has just kind of been pushed aside out into the periphery. And Israel then demands King Saul. So it's a big deal that David is essentially reversing some of that. And I wanted to share, I thought it was kind of cool too, just that the ark made almost in some ways a similar journey that Jesus did, because he started off in a little neglected place. Kiriath Jearim is not far from Bethlehem and eventually goes to Jerusalem. So, but I wanted to share a quote here from Lee Cummings, and I read this book recently. It's called Give No Rest. It is a very short, easy read. I promised it to Janine next, but you guys should borrow it when she's done, because he just gives a very short, concise summary of the prayer movement and the reason why it's so important to have worship and the Lord in the center of our culture, and compares that kind of to really where the American church is at right now. But anyway, so I wanted to share this quote from his book. It says, instead of valuing the presence, they just left it out of the enemy's hand and in the outskirts of their land. They were okay with the ark being marginalized. Must be they didn't think it was useful to them anymore. Though it had made it across the border and into Israel's territory, the ark wasn't placed back at the center of culture. And I think that's kind of just grievous, because the Israelites were okay with that. And it's easy, it's hard, I think, sometimes for us to see ourselves in this story, because we don't have God in a physical ark anymore, right? His presence is no longer contained in this box of glory that we can't look at, can't touch. But in many ways, you could say that as a church, at least in the West and in our nation, we've kind of pushed him off to the outskirts, and we're content to give God a little fraction of our time throughout the week, and then really not put him at the center for the rest of it. And I think COVID was a season that was very telling that, when we lost some of our structure of church, what did we lose? Did we actually did we lose something of the Lord, or did we just lose a program and a routine? And so I think that it's amazing in that Saul, as we see in Saul's kingship, Saul does not prioritize the ark at all. It's really not mentioned a whole lot. But David, as soon as he becomes king, as soon as he has the power and the authority, he brings the ark to Jerusalem. It is at the forefront of his priorities. And this is amazing, because if you want to know what's important to somebody, or what is really on the inside, you see that come out. You see that come out sometimes, we see what's inside us come out when we get squeezed and we're in a trial, and all this stuff we didn't know was in our heart just comes to the surface, and we're like, oh, I didn't know that was in me, right? But you also see it when we're blessed and when we have power or privilege or favor, anointing in different areas of our lives. You see what's important to people, because if I had, God knows what I would do if I had all the money in the world that I could just spend on whatever, right? Too many clothes, too much coffee, I don't know, probably nothing good, right? But David, when he's put in a position of prominence, one of the first things he does as king is he restores God to his rightful place in the nation. And that was a really, really big deal. So in this season of David's life, this is significant. I kind of skipped over a few chapters in 2 Samuel 5. David's anointed king by all of Israel, which is big, because before he was only followed by part of Israel, and he's still warring with the house of Saul. And finally, he's brought to a place where all of Israel is finally on board with him as king. And even, the king of Tyre sends gifts to David. And it says in 2 Samuel 5:12, it's that David had this light bulb moment. After the king of Tyre sent him gifts, he's like, oh my gosh, this is it. God is put me here, I'm king. And it kind of hits him in that way. And it says, David realized that Adonai had established him as king over all Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. So we'd kind of jump back now to our chapter that we read earlier. What's interesting about David trying to bring the ark back into Jerusalem is that in some ways, you'd think that this was primarily a positive thing, and it was. I think ultimately the Lord was very pleased with it. But we see this problem that they try to move the ark, and God strikes Uzzah dead. And like most of us are kind of looking at that and we're like, man, you're just trying to catch it. Like if the ark of God is about to fall and Uzzah's just like, no. And God strikes him dead. So a lot of us would look at that and be like, well, what was the big deal? Like, I don't know why he died. And even David was like, oh my gosh, like this is a fearful thing. But the problem with that was primarily that they were not following God's prescribed order for the ark. The ark was meant to be carried by Levites. And so 1 Chronicles 15 is a parallel chapter to 2 Samuel 6. It has the same story, but it gives us a little bit of insight. And David actually says, because he calls the Levites and he says, because you didn't carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us because we did not seek him according to the rule. And so this is kind of interesting because you see here that like even though David's intention of bringing the ark to Jerusalem was a good thing and God blessed it ultimately, the way that they went about it, God was not messing around with that. Like he really wasn't, because he had a prescribed way of doing it and they didn't acknowledge that. And if you look at the previous priesthood, that the priests were just dishonoring, they're like grabbing the meat before it's totally burned. And the whole people of Israel are using God, and they're like, well, let's just call him into battle when it's beneficial to us and when we need his help. And God is like, we're not doing that again. Like, we're not going that direction again. Like, I'm going to be rightfully placed in the center, or we're not having it. And so the entire nation, like, could you imagine, like, they're having this big parade of, like, thousands upon thousands of people, and they're celebrating, and they're singing and dancing, and all of a sudden, Uzzah dies, and everyone is like, they have the fear of the Lord, because they handled it in a way that man thought was good, but not in a way that God thought was good. And I'm going to share one more Lee Cummings quote from his book. He says, the problem was the ark was meant to be carried on poles and on the shoulders of priests. God would not be handled. During Israel's sojourn in the wilderness, God had given them very clear and specific instructions about how the ark was supposed to be transported and carried. The new cart was man's methodology. It was how the Philistines had transported the ark when they sent it back over the border. It's how things get moved easily with the least amount of work or effort, by men, but it's not God's method. And so I really appreciate that quote because I feel like it gives light on like, why was God taking that so seriously, and how it's not like when we come to him, like we have to come to him in the way that he desires and the way that he's laid out for us, and not in a way that looks best to man, really. And I like, so I want to share two more thoughts from that. And the one is that I love that ultimately this is a successful thing, and they do bring the ark to Jerusalem once David now realizes, all right, we're going to do it, and we're going to do it right, the way that you said you wanted this. And they do it right, and they bring it in, and there's just this great celebration because now David's offering these costly sacrifices every so many steps, sacrifice all the way into Jerusalem. But I love that ultimately, I think this is kind of a fun foreshadowing of Jesus, because there's going to be a day when he goes up as king. And I love Psalm 47. It says, clap your hands, all peoples, shout to God with loud songs of joy, for the Lord, the Most High, is to be feared, a great king over all the earth. He subdued peoples under us and nations under our feet. He chose our heritage for us, the pride of Jacob, whom he loves. God has gone up with a shout, the Lord with the sound of a trumpet. Sing praises to God, sing praises to our King, sing praises. For God is the King of all the earth, sing praises with a psalm. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. The princes of the people gather as the people of the God of Abraham, for the shields of the earth belong to God. He is highly exalted. I love this picture of the Israelites are bringing the ark into Jerusalem with David, with all these instruments and shouting and singing. And one day, that's going to be Jesus. One day that will be him going up as king over the nation. Second thought I just wanted to share was from Hebrews chapter 12. And it talks about the Israelites in the wilderness, but it encourages and reminds us, hey, like, you are not drawing near to this mountain, but you've come to the heavenly Jerusalem. And it encourages us to heed the voice of God as he shakes everything that can be shaken, and to have the fear of the Lord. Essentially, it ends with, let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. And so the question that, like, I just kind of want to, like, consider this morning is, are we giving God the worship that he wants? Because it's very easy for us to think about worship in our own terms, but, like, Jesus talks very clearly about worshiping in spirit and in truth. And what exactly, like, he spells out for us in his word, like, what does he want that to look like? What is, how does he want to be loved? How does he want to be adored? And how do we ascribe worth to him? And so I think it's important for us to not just kind of, like, worship the way only we think about it. I'm like, okay, I sang a couple songs, I worshiped, and that's not wrong and that's not untrue, but to have a deeper understanding of, like, all right, am I really worshiping him in spirit and in truth in the way that he desires, and searching out the scriptures for that. And the last thing I want to touch on is Michael. So, I can imagine, like, this lady's getting not the best picture of her portrayed here. And she's had a rough relationship with David. Like, David paid for her with Philistine foreskins, and now, like, and then Saul gave her to somebody else. She's probably been poisoned by Saul, like, over years, having a bad view of David and bitterness. She's married to another man, and finally David, after years, comes back and is like, all right, like, bring me my wife. And now she's back in the palace with him. But it's interesting because when you read the story in 2 Samuel 6, like, she's not participating in the parade. Like, she's just kind of watching it from afar. And she's kind of just evaluating it. And you can imagine there's maybe a little bitterness in there. But what's interesting about Michael is that she would have seen her father as king. So she's already got some preconceived notions of what does it look like for a king to be honorable before people. And David is not matching that at all, because David, in his humility and in his love for the Lord, is exalting. When he's bringing the ark into Jerusalem, he's really making the statement that, like, I'm not the greatest king in Israel. He is. Like, God is the great king over Israel, and he should be the center of our government and of our culture, not me. And so Michael sees that, and she despises it. And I think that it's worth noting that, because there's different reasons you might give for that. But at the end of the day, that there are things like pride, or even our esteem of man's opinions, or the fear of man, the love of money, whatever it may be, that will cause us to despise worship. Like, and when people put God in the center, there's typically accusation. Like Mary, I think Priscilla last week talked about Mary and Jesus, but, like, when we pour out an offering to the Lord, like, sometimes even it's our own family members that are like, why are you, like, doing something so extravagant? Especially because what David's doing is done in the context of a culture where for decades they were used to having God over there. Like, and they didn't want him in the center, and they were okay with just kind of going about their business in their normal lives without him actually being in his rightful place. And so next week, I think we can touch on a little bit about, like, God's, like, the way that David really started a totally different order in some ways of worship when he moved the ark to Jerusalem. We'll look at next week, we'll look at the way he, like, brought in singers and musicians and all of these things, and what he set up and how that was a little different than what previously had been. But yeah, I think what I just kind of wanted to leave us with this morning, or to come away with, is really, at the end of the day, like, are we bringing our best to God, and are we bringing him what he wants? And so just a couple of closing thoughts or questions as we go into a time of responses. Are we bringing God the worship he wants with a fear and awe of God? Are we despising in any way like his offerings? Are we despising the things that we're commanded to bring or to give to him in our time or our money or our obedience in our physical bodies, whatever that may be, our relationships? And then like the Israelites, like are we content to kind of have him over there? Like, have we in any way pushed him to the outskirts? And then like David, do we use, the power or the giftings that God has given us to exalt him and not ourselves? Like, do we use our giftings and the blessings really that God has poured out over us to point people's eyes towards Jesus? And so that's just kind of, those are some thoughts that I have just kind of for us to pray through today. But I also just wanted to soberly kind of acknowledge that like our nation is not too dissimilar from where the Israelites were at. And so even, as we pray for America regularly in the prayer room, like, I know, I don't think it's wrong at all to pray for God to bless us and deliver us from our enemies, but really at the forefront, like, of our prayers for our nation should be that we would tear down our idols and turn back to God, because he's not fooled when we're like, help, bless us, like, but we really don't care about him any other time. And he doesn't play games with that. So just kind of a thought for us as we, throughout the week, pray for others or pray for our own nation. So I want to just invite you guys to just kind of turn to your neighbors and pray for each other in small groups. Could be about any one particular point from one of these questions or anything else, but just we want to pray. If you don't have a personal prayer request related to this, maybe spend a few minutes just praying for our nation, really to have the fear of the Lord. And then we'll go back into a time of worship together.